To tithe or not to tithe? That is the question. And it's the question that really shouldn't be a question at all. However, in the Christian community, that is always an issue. Some people cannot decide whether or not tithing is beneficial. There are questions about who decided on tithing, whether or not it's in the New Testament, if it was destroyed with the law, so many things. And yet, in the Christian community, in the church, sometimes we have some of the biggest population of poverty. There are too many times that we are at funerals trying to raise money to bury people who spent their entire life in the church and often spent more money on the church clothes than they did investing and doing other things or making sure that they were financially responsible. I'm not saying that everything that they did or didn't do was a result, or everything they had or didn't have was a result of not tithing, but it all begins with tithing. So to tithe or not to tithe will not be a question any longer. At least I hope not. Let me introduce myself. For those of you who have seen some of my other videos, you know me as the Queen Bee of Doing Business Better. But long before I started being the Queen Bee, I've always been Kimberly Guy Davis. I've always been a minister, and I have been walking in that calling for well over 20 years. One of my gifts that I know I have among many is I'm anointed to do business, which is why I do the Queen Bee of Doing Business Better. I have been a tither as long as I can remember because I understand and I believe and I walk by the principles of God. And I'm telling you, I have so many testimonies I could give you about tithing. I have watched God do his handiwork, and I know that his word never fails, and it never falls short, and it never fails. And one thing about God, he cannot lie, unlike man. Now, this is just the first video of a few to talk about tithing. I give that disclosure because I know that for many, it's not always the principle of tithing, but sometimes the concern about the church or whether or not you're planting and tithing into good ground. And we will talk about that. But let's first put the issue to rest. Tithing is a principle, and it begins in the book of Genesis, where God gives Adam instructions, and he tells Adam, you can eat from every tree. Nothing is off limit to you, Adam, but this one tree in the center, the tree of good and evil, the tree of life. And that represents a tithe. The word tithe in and of itself means tenth. So when God is asking us to tithe, he's only asking for a dime out of every dollar. Think about it. One dime out of every dollar. That's nothing. And we always look at it as nothing as long as our funds are in reasonable amounts to us. Now, reasonable amounts change depending on what we're talking about. When we're talking about the church, and I'm just going to keep it real, reasonable amounts are real low. Meaning you talk about $1,000 in the church, all of a sudden everybody's throat is itching and everything. That same person, if you're talking about going to an NFL game or an NBA game or going to a concert, all of a sudden now that same $1,000 that was just off limits in the house of God is now not even enough to get them where they want to go. So it's all about our priorities, which is why the question of to tithe or not to tithe is always an issue. It's really not about the dime out of every dollar. It's more about not wanting to release that money because you feel like you can do so much more with it. And it's almost like we get to a point sometimes as people and you can get stingy. You'd rather spend it doing things that impress other people rather than investing and giving back to the very God who gives us power to obtain wealth. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In the book of Malachi, the third chapter, 8th verse, he says, will a man rob God? He said, yet you have robbed me even in tithes and offering. And in giving the tithes and offering, first of all, let's go back. I hope I was clear when I said that tithe is a tenth. All God is asking for is a dime out of every dollar. For every dollar, you give a dime and you get to keep 90 cents. Then not only is that all he's asking, but when you give the tithe, you are acting in obedience with God's word, because he did not change his word. He did not change his mind. He did not go back and say, you know what I spoke the first time was incorrect, because God cannot lie. He cannot make mistakes. He does not misspeak. Whenever you start playing around with tithing or the principle, and you start trying to nickel and dime the word and piece together the word to fit your need, you are really using your characteristics and trying to portray them off from God. God doesn't misspeak. He is omnipotent. He is omniscient. So it's not like he said something and then all of a sudden forgot and said, you know what, I'm going to let that go. No. And like I said, this is video number 1 of to tithe or not to tithe. And we will deal with all of the little petty things and the things that we use as excuses to not tithe. In the book of Malachi, God says that bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in my house. And prove me now herewith, said the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing that you will not have room enough to receive. One blessing from God can change your life. And that's the first promise that he gives us. And I love the way the word says, prove me. That's the one thing about tithing. Whenever I talk to people about tithing, I always encourage them to do it. And I said, just prove God. Just do it. Because God cannot lie. I am confident in being able to say it, because I know that God honors his word. It's not about me. It's not about believing me, but it's about proving and believing God. Then he says in the 11th verse, and I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, and he shall not destroy the fruits of your ground. Neither shall your vine cast her fruit before time in the field, says the Lord of hosts. So the first promise that God gives us on tithing is that he will pour out a blessing. One, because that's all it takes. He says, I'll give you one blessing and you won't have room enough to receive it. Then he says that I will rebuke the devourer for your sake. What is the devourer? I always tell people, especially if you have heard and know anything about tithing, then once you know you are in obligation, meaning you are held accountable because now you know. Once you know about tithing and you don't, and I've seen people do it and hit or miss, because whenever you do something, whenever you walk in obedience to God, there is always going to be opposition to come. Now, we say those words, we talk about the opposition, but when it happens, very, very rarely do we really recognize that, hey, this is opposition coming to test me, coming to make sure that I'm going to do what I said I was going to do, and that's tithe. So you got to think about it, you got to prepare, and you got to expect the opposition. And a lot of times we just don't do it. We say the words, but then when it happens, it totally leaves our mind. It's like we're speaking a word, and we're speaking or talking about a God in whom we do not believe, not fully. So the devourer is anything that comes against you to take and rob you of your money. Think about it. I've seen it happen a lot of times. You don't give your tithe. You say, you know what, I'll make it up next week. Oh, I'll do this. And you go and forsake it to do something else. In that moment, that's when the car breaks down. In that moment, that's when you forgot to pay a bill and something is repossessed or the lights are off or something happens. So the devourer that God is talking about is anything that comes against to mess and take away your wealth and your wealth building and your ability to obtain wealth. Then he goes on to say that and he shall not destroy the fruits of your ground. Doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter what your line of work may be. God is the one who empowers you to obtain wealth, equipped you with the talent that landed you the job, that brings about the check that you now do not want to tithe on. You cannot have, be, or do anything without God. Remember, we always say, in Him we live, in Him we move, in Him we have our being. Once again, something you say that you may not think about, but you may want to start thinking about it. So when it says, the promise says, He will not destroy the fruit of your ground. You can till the ground all day long, but if God does not do His part, that ground will yield you nothing. There are very few things. There is nothing that we can do without God. Nothing. Doesn't matter. Your talent came from God. It does not have to be. A lot of times we only give God credit if we think that we're something we can use in a church. And that's kind of crazy because almost every gift can be used in church, but we'll talk about that later. So if it's not preaching, if it's not singing gospel, then we act as if the gift is something we just got on our own. But in Him we move, in Him we live, in Him we have our very being. So he goes on to say that I won't destroy the fruit of your vine, but not only that, neither shall your vine cast her fruit before the time. Ever had an idea? Ever had a concept? Ever thought about doing something and right when you thought it should be done, it fell through, but later on it came through? That is the protection of God. When you used to hear your parents and your grandparents say, danger seen and unseen. God says, I will not let you cast your fruit before it's time. I will not let you walk into the business before it's ready, before you're ready, before it's going to be profitable. I will make sure that you don't make decisions that you are not ready to make. So when God asks for one dime out of every dollar, He's asking because obviously it's not for the money, right? Obviously, He's asking for the obedience because there is nothing more intimate than being obedient to God. When you say that you love God, when you say that you trust Him to provide and then turn around and give your money, that is the most intimate thing, and that is the most the biggest confirmation you can give to show that, God, I really do trust you. I have no clue. I don't know right now. It looks like I can't make it off of the full amount, but I'm going to trust you with this 10th right off the top. And I'm not talking about 10th off your net, but 10th off your gross. I'm going to trust you, God, and then I'm going to do everything else. And I'm telling you that in doing so, you will watch. You'll be able to stand back and see God work. You will feel Him talking to you, giving you direction. There will be things that you would normally do that you wouldn't do because God is protecting you. And one of the things we all know as Christians is that the hardest person to protect yourself from is yourself. It's not things outside of you. Remember, it's what comes out of a man that defiles him. And many times it's our decisions, it's our mouth, it's a combination of the two. And in giving God His tithe, you are giving and handing it everything over to Him. He says, all I'm asking for is a dime. You give me that dime. Not only am I going to allow you to keep the 90, but I'm going to bless that dime so that you're going to not be able to receive everything that comes out of that one act of obedience. God teaches us that obedience is better than a sacrifice. So I wanted to make sure and set the record straight. Whenever somebody comes to you, whenever somebody challenges you, whenever you're thinking about it, whenever you're getting ready to do something, you want to do something, and you're thinking, if I didn't tithe, I could do this and I can catch it up next time. You cannot afford to cheat or rob God, because God is the source. Everything else is just a resource, and the resource falls up under the source. The source will never change, but he can always direct your resources. He can always direct and decide where your money comes from. You remember when they were headed, it was time to pay taxes, and Jesus spoke to the fish, and the fish opened his mouth and had the money for the taxes. God as your source, that means you will never fail and you will never be without. That's why David could say, I was young, but now I'm old, and I've never seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed having to beg bread, because he understood the principle of tithing. And we're going to go a little bit further later on. We're going to talk about sowing and reaping. We're going to talk about offering. But we want to begin with understanding tithe. Tithe is not just something that was only in the Old Testament. It was not destroyed by law, because there was no need to destroy a system that already worked. If you ever want to know and to prove, one of the things that happens, whenever there is a principle, the world will always copy it. And even the IRS, even for corporate America, I'm moving into the Queen Bee. Even in corporate America, one of the things that the IRS allows you to write off is 10%, up to 10% of your income to charitable donations. See, they don't call it the church, because there's supposed to be a separation of church and state. But they say charitable contributions up to 10% of your income can be deducted without question. You don't even have to necessarily show proof of it unless you're being audited. That's how you know when it's a strong principle, that the world even copies it. All God is asking of you today, my friend, is a tenth off your gross for every dime you make, whether it be your check, whether it be your business, whether it be your hustle. If you want to see it multiply, if you want to see it thrive, if you want to see things happen and be released in your life, you give your tithe. It's the greatest act of obedience, and it's the greatest investment you can ever make. You will never get that kind of return. He says, not only will I give you 90, but I'm going to bless that dime. So you're ending up with 190%. There is no bank, no credit union that will give you that kind of return off one dime out of every dollar you make. I just want to encourage you. I do not represent any church per se. I have been a minister for over 20 years. I get nothing out of this video but hoping that I am blessing somebody and putting an end to the question of to tithe or not to tithe. Yes, you tithe. We'll tune in and talk about some more. Get ready for part 2. It's been your girl. Normally I would say the Queen Bee, but on this channel and this hour for this time, it's been Minister Kimberly Davis saying, tithe. It is everything. Bye-bye.